Hi, everybody. So today we'll be going over some data best practices. Whether you're using a CRM database software or your own spreadsheets, you are in control of what data you choose to collect and how you store it. In this presentation, we'll go over some guidelines for how to form your own data policy and how to sort of compose your own style guide to make sure that your data remains useful and readable and able to be exported to anywhere that you need to send it. So we'll start right at the beginning with what we collect. There's a lot of emphasis in sort of the world at large about collecting and analyzing all the data we can. That's not necessarily the best solution for every organization. So what I suggest is that you collect what you need, what you use, and what you can gather and record consistently. And I'll step into each one of these topics. What you need, which is the information that you are obligated to collect, either by necessity to supply your services or in some cases by law. What you use, that's going to be the data that you extract from wherever you're storing it. Are you sending emails? Are you sending letters? Are you preparing reports? That's the data that you regularly use. And then the data that you can gather consistently and record consistently. I am sure that everybody has somewhere in their office a pile of paper that has not made it into the database yet. That in general, or has seen such a pile before. In general, if we're not able to store data regularly, it may not be worth collecting. So we'll step into each of these topics first, and then we'll get into some more, some actual rules and style specifics for the actual data fields. Okay, so the first step is, this is the data that we need. This is the contact information, name, the address, the email, the phone number. And then donation information or any other financial transaction information. So if you receive a payment, we want to know the date, we want to know the amount, we want to know how the money was received, the method of payment. If it was a check, we want to record the check number. These are all standard fields that you will see in any type of address book or bookkeeping software. And everybody is familiar with collecting address information. Then we have specifics, items that are fundamental to your particular organization's operations or services or funding. These are going to be fields that you have to invent or create. You need to identify the information because, and I'll step back one moment, the software is not going to know your needs. So you need to identify the fields that you are going to be called upon to report. This is going to be information that is required to apply for or satisfy grant reporting. This is specifics of your donation process. This can be specific constituent information related to the services you provide. And these custom fields will, again, need to be devised by you. You won't be able to rely on a program to tell you what you have to collect. You need to evaluate the information that you deal with and the information that you are required to have and find the holes in this from the standard forms and fill them. So that's the data that you need. And the way to tackle this is to just make a list. Just go through all of your requirements and make sure that you are capturing them everywhere. And for the places where, oh, we're not capturing the tax deductible amount in the general donation transaction information. That's information that you can customize and then move forward with collecting. That's just one example. The next component of data collection is to collect data that you are going to regularly use. And you should avoid collecting data that you're not going to use. When you are giving a form to someone to fill out, or having someone come and sit at your desk and you're asking them questions and inputting their information, if they say to you, why do you need to know that? You need to be able to answer them. And if you're not able to answer them pretty easily, maybe you shouldn't be collecting that data. There aren't, for nonprofits, there aren't a lot of benefits to collecting this extra information. Limiting your data collection to just what you're going to use, it helps to, first of all, it's easier to maintain, and it also helps to build trust with your constituents, because you're not asking them to offer up all of their personal information, only the things that are relevant. And as far as the data that you regularly use, that's going to be different, again, for every organization. Contact information, that obviously that's straightforward. We will use that to send letters, to send thank yous, to send emails. Maybe we have additional attributes that we store so that we can do targeted messaging. If somebody has opted into a specific kind of service, we want a record of that so that we can reach out to them with information about that service. We also want to record data relevant to reporting on your mission. And again, this is going to be very specific to your organization. I mean, if you have any questions about like what sort of data points should we be collecting, I'm happy to talk it over with you, but there's no clear-cut answer that I can give to every organization, because every organization is different. But the general gist of it is that it's going to be information which describes the population that you serve, and it's going to be specific metrics that measure the work that you are doing. So if you are an organization that helps people become gainfully employed, we want to record their employment status, or maybe their, maybe their previous history with interviews and applications. But if you're not going to report on that data, if it's not relevant, maybe you don't need it. The final part of this is data for a specific purpose. If you're collecting data because you want to examine and evaluate your programs, then that is an answer to the question, why do you need to know that? And if you need to know certain factors to do your work, to fulfill your mission, then that is the specific purpose. But asking someone, for example, to supply their household income, that is not something that everybody is going to want to offer up, even though it might be interesting, but it's not necessarily something that will inform your work and forward your mission. The final, or not the final, the next type of, or the reason to collect data and the way to collect data is data that you can collect and record consistently. This means both recording data points that can be gathered easily and regularly, and recorded easily and regularly, and in the same manner every time. Most stored data is going to change infrequently. For example, you only move every so often, you only burn an email address every once in a while, you only change your phone number once in a while. And that's the kind of static data that will make up the core of what you are collecting about people. Information that changes frequently and can easily become outdated is information to avoid collecting. Now, I understand that for many service providers, there are going to be specific actions and responses that we need to record regularly, but we need then a plan for how to collect and record it. And we need to acknowledge the fact that getting that information and storing that information is work. It's man hours, it's time that you have to, a person has to solicit the information and record the information. We have to convince the client to regularly give us that update. And then we have to take time out of our day to store it and categorize it. Now, there are some technological tools that can help with that. There are integrations that can capture data from forms in your website. There are text translators where you can scan things. There are all manner of tools that can help you, but what ultimately is required is a workflow that you establish for your organization to process and record all of the data that you receive. Otherwise, it's going to be useless. That pile of paper that no one has looked at since the person came and sat down at the desk is not doing anything for your organization. It's not providing any insight about the client or your services if nobody is reading it. And the other part of this is that we need to adopt consistent styles and conventions that will be applied throughout the database. That'll be the sort of second half of this, some of those suggestions. How do we format names and addresses? What do we choose to abbreviate? Where do we put the punctuation? Setting up a style guide like that, that the whole organization has, is going to keep your data clean. It's going to keep it usable, predictable. It's just a good idea overall. You must collect data and store it in a secure way. I'm not going to get too deep into data security here. Most of this is common sense. We want to be good stewards of the personal and private information that we're collecting about people, be they clients or donors. Storing data securely is just a matter of good governance. We need a restricted barrier to prevent access to the data that we store, whether that is a digital password or a series of digital passwords, or a physical lock if we're talking about that pile of paper, or a shredder. If you are saving passwords on your device, make sure that the device locks in such a way that only you or an authorized person can access it. Don't look at personal and private data over open networks. It might be very convenient to go to the library where they have an open internet connection and try to get some work done. You can't browse private data on a public network securely. That's not a good practice. Complying with the law. That's obviously we all want to comply with the law. There are not rigorous data security and privacy laws in the United States the way, bar California. But the way that we see in Europe, for example. However, even in the United States, certain personal information must be kept confidential and secure by law. You can be fined if you are found to have not done so. And this is highly personal information, so it's financial account information, social security numbers, medical records that fall under HIPAA, things like that. So if any of those pertain to you, look up the statutes that you need to abide by and make sure that you are. One way to protect your data is to take advantage of the permissions and the access controls that are available on every computer system and almost every type of data software. There will always be ways that you can restrict access, either like a blanket permission, for example, like only I can access this document, or only people who are an administrator or an executive can access the financial details, things like that. And that becomes, those policies become part of your overall data policy, and you should look towards implementing them as applicable. And the final part of securing your data is protecting it from a disaster, either a technological or a natural disaster, by doing regular backups. So collect only the data that you can secure and use secure practices pertaining to your data. So now we'll shift into some tips and best practices for the actual data fields. I've created a address block here for my favorite volunteer teacup sample house. And I have highlighted all of the different fields in different colors. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. These are called compound fields, and they're generally made, they're comprised of individual fields that are connected together. So we have the Honorable Teacup Tea Sample House III with a doctorate in education. She lives at 123 Main Street, apartment 506B in City, State 12345, and then her phone number is there at the bottom. You can store all of this information together if you wanted to, depending on how your system is set up. It's maybe not the best idea, but you could if you wanted to. Whether or not it is the best idea depends on how you're going to use this data. If you will never want to do anything but call or mail to this person, if we're never going to aggregate this, if we never want to say, show me everybody who lives in Kansas City, show me everybody who lives in the 12345 zip code, show me everybody whose last name starts with S, then you can store this all as one block. I wouldn't recommend it. What is stored separately versus together will depend on how you use the data. But when in doubt, you should store the data in separate fields. It is, unless you're extremely good with formatting strings, it is difficult to separate data. It is much easier to store it individually and combine it together. Okay. Oh, and again, when you decide how to do this, decide it for everyone in your organization and add it to your style guide. So one example is the area code and the 7-digit phone number. Now, maybe there are going to be situations where we want to target people with just the area code. If that is the case, that would be specific to one organization. Most of us don't need to do that, so we would store the area code plus the 7-digit phone number together as one field, and you'll find that that is the convention in the standard fields in most address storing software. The trailing extension number, that's usually stored separately because you have to use it separately. You can't just dial in, the 10 numbers plus x83. You need to wait until you're prompted to enter that extension. So it's not part of the whole phone number. So I would suggest, like, for the phone number that we store, the 10-digit phone number and as one field, and then the extension as a second field. That'll be a reasonable case for most people. If you have a specific exception, then by all means, create your system around that, or create your system to include that exception. So looking at names specifically, one name seems like it would be one field. It's not. There's at least 5, but actually as many as 7 or 8 that we, as people who are maintaining lists that we're contacting, probably want to hold on to. We've got the title, which in this case, I've given her, the honorable, but Reverend, Mr., Mrs., Doctor, all of those things are, lieutenant, all of those are titles. Sometimes you get people with multiple titles. We should absolutely collect these separately from the rest of the name. First name, straightforward. Middle name or initial, people have different opinions about this. Some people don't choose to capture the middle name at all. However, some clients and some people that you deal with will always provide a middle name or middle initial. So when I am creating a system, I usually leave room for the middle initial unless people specifically don't want to include it. And if you are in a system where we don't have a middle name field available, you can tag it on to the first name. That's not the best idea. My opinion is that the best idea is to capture it separately, but if we don't have that option, capture it as part of the first name. So it would become teacup tea as the first name. The last name, again, straightforward. Suffixes, again, suffixes can be compound in their own right. We can have multiple suffixes. There are some standard systems that have a preset suffixes like junior, senior, educational degree titles like I've included here. I don't think that it is reasonable to try to capture every possible permutation in such a drop-down menu. So if I were creating a field to store suffix information, I would just leave it as you can put in whatever is applicable, if applicable, rather than trying to shoehorn it into a set list. But this is not, even those 5 fields are not the whole story, because what if somebody has a nickname? We want to capture that separately. Maybe this is not how we want to address an envelope to them. Maybe we don't need to include their educational degree on a mailing envelope. And then we have, for some organizations, it may not be relevant to you, but some organizations thank people publicly for their gifts. And some people are very specific about how they want to be recognized, in the back of the symphony flyer, or on the wall, or whatever the case may be. So these are, I would say, at least 8 fields to capture the whole name. If you have additional circumstances that are specific to your org, it may be even higher. But I would say at least 7 or 8. Public acknowledgement, maybe not everybody needs that one, but for the rest of them, yeah, there's a lot in a name that, yeah. When you store names, store the full name if you have it. If the first name, if they go by Bill, put that the nickname is Bill, put that the first name is William. If it is, obviously there are some people who are just named Bill. But if they have a longer name, use the full and proper name in the first name field. One thing that's difficult to deal with when you're dealing with standard forms is that different cultures have different naming conventions. So in the English-speaking North America, we use first name and last name. That is not the case for a number of Latin American or Asian people. They have, 3 names, 4 names, sometimes more. And the first name is not necessarily, or rather the given name is not necessarily the first one that you hear in a string of names. And like every other cultural difference, the way to broach that subject is just to ask, just to clarify with the person whose data you're collecting to be sure that you're collecting it correctly. I think most people would rather have a question that shows concern than an assumption that could result in a slight. Yeah. Another general rule, don't try to guess what somebody's middle name is. A lot of people have, and even in English-speaking North America, we have double names, which are pretty common. So don't try to guess what somebody's middle name is. Just ask if you can. When you do encounter these double names, I think they're pretty common in the South, and they're also pretty common with Hispanic people. And also, anyway. When you encounter these double names, store them together as a first name. They are one name. Store them together as one name. And again, if you're unsure, just ask. When you have multiple last names or hyphenates, store it all together. Don't get fancy. Don't try to break it up. Just accept it at face value. So Billy Ray is one name. Lopez Alvarez, 2 last names. We'll store them both together as one last name. Leading initials should be stored with the first name. Or if somebody only has their initials, it's okay, if they only supply their initials, maybe they exclusively go by their last name and they, it's just M. Mooers. It's okay to record just an initial in the first name field. Some other common double names to be aware of, Billy and Tommy, for both, those are sort of all genders. They're sort of unisex. We see compounded or double names with both of those. Mary and Maria are 2 other ones. Mary Sue, Maria Guadalupe, those are single first names. Don't try to say, oh, it's like you wouldn't have Mary Jane and say, oh, Jane is the middle name. We wouldn't do that. We would know that Mary Jane is one first name. So if it's not something like that where you don't automatically know, either ask or default to assuming it's one first name. Okay. Spouses and partners. That's another part of the naming conventions. And something I see, unfortunately, a lot is that people are tempted to store spouses and partners together on one record. But we want to ensure that the data that we're collecting is thorough and accurate, and nobody's first name is Bob and Jan. Spouses and partners or other household members, whatever the case may be, should have separate records that are linked together. Now, And the reason for that is that in most cases, you want to cultivate good relationships with both members of the household. Um, Unfortunately, not every couple is forever, but as an organization, as a nonprofit, you want to ensure that your relationship with both parties persists, so that they can still avail themselves of your services. We won't lose a relationship with somebody. And also, we might be able to grow the services that we're providing just by cultivating those relationships. So store people separately and link them together. Now, most software, a CRM, a nonprofit database, they will have mechanisms in place to link people together. Some will even let you define exactly what kind of relationship it is and customize that, which is great. For people who are just keeping their data on a computer in a spreadsheet, a good way to do this is to include in one person's record a reference to the spouse's unique identifier. And that way, the two will be joined through one common data field, that unique identifier, which we'll get to in a moment, and the records stay linked in that way. When we have spouses and partners, most often this comes up because people want to be recognized as a member of a couple. They want to say, yes, I gave you this donation, but I want you to know that it came from both my spouse and I. So in those cases, we can customize not the first name field, but the format for the mailings and the format for the public acknowledgement. So these fields up here that I mentioned in the previous slide, or the one that I've just clicked back to here, these don't have to follow the same strict conventions where we want to make sure that a first name are all the first names and the last name are all the last names. The format for mailings, the format for public acknowledgements, and even the informal name or the informal greeting, those are custom text that can be tailored to the specific person or couple without corrupting the general data that we're storing about the individual. Unique identifiers. So I mentioned them just a moment ago as a mechanism that we would use to link two people in the database together. When you're using a database software, that software is going to assign a unique identifier to every record. If it's a spreadsheet, the unique identifier is the row number. If you are storing one person's data on row 4, it's only going to be that one person on row 4. Row 4 is all about them. They are all about row 4. Their data is not going to be anywhere besides row 4. In theory, we're doing a good job. And yeah, so the unique identifier is what we tie a record to, and it really encapsulates the record because every, like I said, row 4 or the number generated is only going to apply to that one record. There are a lot of functions that require these numbers to be unique. Now, a big database like Salesforce, they generate an alphanumeric 18-character number that is very difficult to recall, even when you're looking at the record. And certainly, it's not something that people could realistically memorize, let alone for all of the records. We can refer to it within the system, but we're not going to be referring to it in real life. We're not going to be referring to it in conversation or when we as humans are trying to look at these records. So we need something more accessible, and that is where email comes in as a unique identifier. Mobile phone, that is another one, which Generally, people are not sharing their cell phone with someone else. It's exclusive to them. Email, same situation. This is a field that nobody else is going to have. Only one person, one record, one unique identifier, and it will carry throughout the entire system. Every time we see the unique identifier, we know what record it belongs to. Lots of systems expect the unique identifier to be the email address. It's sort of it's the common expectation. When you do when you work with any sort of integrations, something like MailChimp, something like Constant Contact, or Eventbrite, the email address is how they are separating one John Smith from another John Smith, because people obviously have duplicate names. People can come from, we can have multiple people at the same address. How do we differentiate between them? The unique identifier. So it is very important in terms of the integrity of your database that you are maintaining these unique identifiers and the common fields that are assumed to be unique identifiers, like email, like mobile phone. So you must avoid assigning an email address to more than one person. Now, I know that there are cases where people do share an email. Older people tend to do this. We just have one set up for the households, but it's not just older people. Younger people are like, oh, we have a household email, everything that is common to us, we both use it. That's the only email we're willing to share. That's true in a lot of cases. If it is, fine. Only one person can have that as their unique identifier. We would not want to assign an email to two different people. One reason for that is that we don't want to send, if we ever do a mailing, we don't want to send it twice to the same address. But the other reason is that we can keep it as a unique identifier. We can use it to identify the primary person in a household. There generally is one. Unfortunately, they can maybe draw straws and pick who it is. It doesn't have to be one person or the other. But we want to make sure that we're not assigning these fields that are expected to be unique to anybody else. Address formats and style conventions. As I said earlier, an organization should work to establish its own style guide for collecting data. And this is basically how we're going to write addresses, how we're going to write dates and times, how we're going to record all the information that we collect. How we're going to punctuate it. So there are a number of factors to consider here. Street numbers and directions. So we can keep it real simple, like W54ST for West 54th Street, or we can write out the whole thing, West 54th Street. I understand that some people think that writing the whole address out looks nicer, and maybe maybe there are certain applications for writing out the whole address. In general, we want to limit the amount of superfluous information that we're collecting. And with address validation, they really endeavor to pare it down to just the absolute essentials. So writing out the whole, like, West 54th with the TH, the whole street, maybe it looks nice if you're sending out a formal invitation to an event. But if you take that information to a mailer, they are likely to validate the address and come back with the abbreviated version anyway. So it may be a waste of time to collect the longer version. But however you choose to do it, choose and then abide by that choice. Do it the same way every time. Don't be guessing whether or not we're going to write out the word street or the word avenue or the word terrace. We want to have that consistent. We want the addresses of the people to match the addresses on, the address on the mailing return label. And we want it to be consistent throughout so that nobody is wasting time guessing how we should do it. So that the street address is one example of a field where a decision needs to be made. And then don't drop the street type. I'm sure that most folks in Kansas City are well aware that we sometimes reuse the numbers. So we have 54th Terrace, 54th Street, 54th Road, and they're three completely different physical locations. We don't want to, but there are, for example, towns where there's only one West 54 and it can't be mistaken. That's not true everywhere, so include the street type everywhere. Let's see. I see there's a question about the auto-find in Salesforce for the mailing address, and I will be addressing that on the next slide. Other things to consider, apartments, suites, units, numbers, floor numbers. When you validate an address, with one of the, the formal address validation systems, it's going to correct all of these to either APT or STE for apartment or suite, or occasionally FL for floor number. Any other additional superfluous text for an address is going to get trimmed down. So we might as well start with what it's going to be. States. Abbreviate the states. Use the common two-letter abbreviations for all the states. It's not worth. It takes more space. It's longer to type. People can misspell things. Just use the two states. That's my strong suggestion to everybody. And then the zip code. Something to be aware of is that some softwares are built around a 5-digit zip code. Now, we know that for international addresses, and even for our own zip +4, they are more than 5, or sometimes less than 5. Be aware of the restrictions on the software that you're using and be prepared to create custom fields to capture the data that you're choosing to if necessary. Okay, address validation. Another free service of the United States Postal Service. I am a fan. Oh, and I put the wrong link here. It should be USPS, not UPS. Anyhow, I'll correct that before we send this out. The United States Postal Service has a record of every mailing address that exists and a preferred format for writing them. And you can go to their website and look this information up. They also make available an API, which is what Google Maps uses. They have a system called Coding Accuracy Support System that basically brings any address that you write, any format, into line with their formatting. And some software, such as Salesforce, has an inbuilt API that will allow you to do an address lookup, and it'll spit back the correctly formatted address. And most mailing vendors, if you say we need to do a mailing and here's our mailing list, send everybody a card letting them know that our annual appeal has started. Most of those organizations are going to give you the option of validating the addresses before they run the mailing. That is ultimately going to save time and money, because we don't want to pay for postage on things that are going to bounce back. And we want to ensure delivery as much as possible when we do mailings. So going to a CAS certified vendor such as Smarty or AccuZip, or there are dozens. You can search for them, but CAS certification is what you're looking for. And that's something you can use to validate your whole mailing list. And it's honestly worth doing if you're storing large amounts of data, because they'll be able to pair out everything that is not valid, and that's the point. Useful. Okay. And again, yeah, that is built into some of the software that we're using regularly. Okay, oops. So the final piece that I wanted to talk about is notes and uncertainties. Sometimes when we're recording data, we're not certain that the data is accurate or current. In those cases, for those cases, I would suggest that we always have available some kind of extra field to capture notes. Sometimes it's called descriptions, sometimes it's called comments, but it's basically a free form text field that you have available on a record to put anything that does not otherwise fit in a field. So I have a couple of examples that I brought up here. I once received a letter that said, now my name is spelled M-E-G-A-N, so I once received a letter that was Dear Megan/Meghan, spelling ? And these things are difficult to capture. So this went out, nobody caught it in the proofreading, and it's bad data. And I don't remember, I don't remember the organization that sent it to me. I don't believe I still have a relationship with them. Another example, probably a worse example, is attaching sensitive data any old place. Now, your database may or may not have the ability to mark someone as deceased. If it doesn't, put that in the notes. Don't overwrite someone's first name. Don't append it to any which field that you can find. This is the Robert Smith example is a made-up example. I have seen mailing lists where a first name with the giant block letter word deceased came up on it. That's not something we want to include in mailings that we do. Storing extra information in fields where it doesn't belong is a very bad practice. It is difficult to catch bad data when you do it. We are expecting first names to be first names. We're not checking to see if somebody accidentally put a date in there. It wouldn't occur to someone to check for the kinds of just random data that can winnow its way into these fields. So as a rule, only put the data that is supposed to be in places. Make your field names easily understandable. Don't call it something that could be mistaken for something else, and don't make notes in other data fields. It's, if you take one thing away from today's talk, it should be that. This is definitely a case where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, because untangling these errors, it's almost always a manual process. And when you're talking about big lists, that's a lot of your time that you will be wasting just reviewing all this, because a computer is not going to be trained to recognize all the myriad permutations of errors that could exist. So yeah, only store the data that is supposed to be in any of the fields that you're using. And if you need space for notes, make a space for notes. That's it. Okay. So that is my presentation.